The marketplace was loud with voices, but her ears only heard the heavy clink of her own chains. The iron collar rubbed against her thin neck. The cuffs on her wrists left deep red marks, and the weight of the chain pulled her small body down. She stood among others, but she felt more alone than anyone in the world. The smell of dust, sweat, and spoiled food filled the air. Buyers moved around, their eyes sharp and greedy, searching for the cheapest body to use. She lowered her head. The auctioneer shouted numbers, his rough voice booming across the crowd. A heavy hand shoved her forward, making her stumble onto the wooden platform. The crowd laughed when she almost fell. Her knees trembled, her legs weak from hunger, but she forced herself to stand. She had been told what would happen. She would be sold, broken, and her body used for whatever her buyer wanted. That was the rule. That was the life of slaves. The auctioneer pulled her hair back so everyone could see her face. She wanted to resist, but her body was too weak. The man shouted her name, her species, her age, then opened the bidding. At first, no one raised a hand. A silence spread, cold and sharp. Then laughter broke out. "She stinks," someone shouted. "Not even worth feeding," another laughed. 10 coins for that? More like 10 for her chains." The auctioneer grew red with anger, but he pushed harder, his voice rising, begging for someone to pay. Still, the crowd mocked. She stood there, eyes empty, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum of despair. Finally, a voice rose from the back. It was calm, not loud, but it cut through the noise. 10. The crowd roared with laughter. 10? 10 coins? Is he mad? No, not 10 coins, the auctioneer barked. $10. The laughter grew. $10 was less than the price of a bottle of water, less than the rotten fruit lying in the mud. Yet the voice was steady, unshaken. $10. The auctioneer slammed his hand down. Sold. The chain around her neck was tugged, and she was dragged off the platform. She did not resist. What was the point? She had been sold like trash. If this man had paid so little, then he had no reason to value her at all. In her mind, she braced for pain, braced for nights of cruelty, for hands that would break her body just to prove they could. She had heard the stories from other slaves. Some buyers paid high prices to keep their slaves alive. But cheap ones did not live long. She dared to look up at him as they walked away. He was human, tall, with dark hair and plain clothes. His eyes were steady but unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't glare, didn't look at her the way the others did. That scared her even more. She could not tell if he wanted her for labor, for cruelty, or for something worse. The road away from the market was quieter, but the chain around her neck was still heavy. Dust rose under her bare feet as she followed. He didn't whip her, didn't shout at her, only walked in silence, leading her through narrow alleys and out into the edge of the settlement. Her thoughts were wild. Maybe he was taking her somewhere dark. Maybe he wanted privacy before hurting her. Maybe he wanted no one to hear her screams. Her body shook with every step, her breath short and fast, but she forced herself to keep moving. Fighting was useless. If she resisted, she would only make her death slower. Finally, he stopped at a small shelter made of wood and metal sheets. It looked old but solid, like a poor man's home. He opened the door and stepped inside, motioning for her to follow. She obeyed, her heart pounding. Inside was quiet, almost too quiet. A wooden chair, a small table, a simple bed, no whips, no cages, no chains on the wall. That confused her. He turned and looked at her. She flinched, expecting his hand to strike. But he only reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked the chain on her wrists. The cuffs fell with a dull sound. She rubbed her skin in shock, staring at the red marks left behind. He didn't say a word. He only set the cuffs aside and walked to the corner. Her knees felt weak. She didn't understand. Why buy her if not to use her? Why free her wrists so quickly? Her mind screamed warnings. This is a trick. He's playing with you. Wait. Soon the pain will come. Her stomach growled loudly, breaking the silence. She froze, embarrassed. He didn't laugh. He didn't curse. Instead, he pulled out a piece of bread from the table and placed it in front of her. She stared at it, not moving. He nodded once, slow, as if saying, "Eat." She looked at the bread, then at him. Her hands shook as she reached out. It smelled fresh, warm, and real. She took a small bite, waiting for him to slap it from her hands. But he didn't move. He only sat back on the chair and watched quietly, his face calm as she ate. Tears burned her eyes. She tried to swallow them down with the bread, but they came anyway. For the first time in her life, she was not hit for eating. She was not mocked for existing. And that confused her more than any chain, more than any cruelty. Because cruelty she understood. But kindness? That was more frightening than anything. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the sound of her shallow breaths. She sat on the corner of the bed, knees pulled close to her chest, eyes wide and alert. The man lay on the floor with only a blanket under him. She waited for him to rise, to take what he wanted, but he never moved. His breathing was slow and steady, like someone who had fallen into deep sleep. It made no sense to her. Why would he buy her only to sleep far away, leaving her untouched? Her body trembled with fear more than the cold. Every creak of the wooden house made her flinch. Each passing minute stretched like hours. Her mind played cruel tricks, whispering that he was only pretending, waiting until she lowered her guard. She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat, fast and painful. She couldn't close her eyes. Closing them would mean weakness, and weakness always brought punishment. The bread still lingered in her mouth from earlier, soft and strange. It was the first food she had eaten without being slapped or mocked. She wanted to believe it was real kindness, but no slave dared believe in such things. Trust was poison. She repeated that in her head until dawn light crept through the cracks in the wooden wall. When he finally stirred, she stiffened, ready for the worst. He rose, stretched his arms, and walked past her without a glance. She stared, frozen, as he left the room. A moment later, the sound of water splashing came from outside. She sat there, confused, too afraid to move. When he returned, he carried a small bowl of water and placed it near her feet. Then he set a clean rag beside it and stepped back. Her throat tightened. She stared at the bowl, then at him. His expression was plain, almost dull, but not cruel. Slowly, she dipped her hands into the water. It was cool against her skin, washing away dirt that had clung for weeks. She rubbed the rag over her arms, her neck, her face. For the first time in years, she saw her skin beneath the filth. She thought he might mock her for looking weak, but he simply turned away, giving her privacy. She wanted to ask him why. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Slaves were not supposed to speak without permission. Her voice had been silent for too long. She bit her lip and said nothing. Later, he left the house again and returned with something wrapped in cloth. When he opened it, she saw food, vegetables, meat, and another piece of bread. He set it on the table, divided it into 2 equal portions, and pushed one plate toward her. She hesitated. Sharing food with a master was unthinkable. It had to be a test, another cruel game. But when she didn't move, he simply began eating his share, calm and slow. The smell was too strong, her hunger too sharp. She took one piece, small as a mouse, and chewed carefully. No blow came. No hand reached across the table to snatch it back. She took another, then another, until the plate was empty. When she looked up, his eyes were on her. Not hungry, not cruel, just steady. It made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. That night, she expected things to change. She expected him to demand payment for the food, the water, the freedom of her wrists. She sat stiff again on the bed, bracing herself. But he lay once more on the floor with his blanket and fell asleep, leaving her untouched. The fear inside her shifted into something worse, confusion. Pain she understood, hunger she knew, cruelty was familiar, but this strange silence, this strange kindness, it broke her more than any chain could. She curled tighter, whispering to herself in the dark, waiting for the mask to fall, waiting for him to show the monster she was sure hid behind his quiet face. The night air pressed heavy against the walls of the small shelter, carrying the faint howl of wind from the barren land outside. She lay on the bed, her body stiff, every muscle tense, as though the weight of invisible chains still bound her. The blanket he had given her felt alien on her skin, soft, warm, and undeserved. She clutched it tightly, but her eyes stayed fixed on him. He slept again on the floor, not even close to her, one arm folded under his head, the other resting loosely on his chest. She waited for the sudden shift, for the moment his eyes would open and reveal the predator she knew he must be. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her heart beating so fast it hurt. Sleep pulled at her, but she didn't dare close her eyes. Slaves who slept too deeply often woke with pain in their bodies and shame in their souls. She had lived long enough to know that kindness always carried a price. The hours dragged on. Shadows shifted across the walls as the moonlight slipped away, replaced by pale dawn. She stared at him until her eyes burned. He didn't move, didn't reach for her, didn't even roll closer in his sleep. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. If he had struck her, she would have known how to survive. But this silence, this distance, left her lost in a storm of questions. Her hands shook as she touched the raw marks on her wrists, the places where the cuffs had cut her skin. The iron had defined her for so long that the freedom of bare flesh felt unnatural. She pressed her fingers there, remembering how it felt to be dragged through markets, how eyes judged her like a piece of spoiled fruit. She remembered the laughter of the crowd when she was sold for less than the price of stale bread. The shame still burned like fire inside her. When he finally stirred, she drew the blanket around her as though it could shield her. He stretched, yawned softly, and stood. For a moment, his gaze fell on her, but it was not a gaze that stripped her bare or weighed her worth. It was brief, quiet, and then gone as he left the room. She blinked in disbelief. No order barked at her, no chain pulled, no hand raised. Just silence. Her stomach tightened with hunger, but she dared not move until he returned. He carried something in his hands, fruit, small and bruised but fresh. He placed them on the table and stepped aside. She stared at the fruit, suspicion burning in her chest. Was this another test? Did he want to see how desperate she was? Would he punish her for touching what was not hers? Her hunger roared louder than her fear. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the soft skin of the fruit. She expected a shout, a strike, but his voice, when it came, was calm. Eat. The word pierced her like a blade. It was permission. A simple word she had never been given in her life. She took a bite, the juice sweet against her dry tongue, and tears welled in her eyes again. She turned her face away, ashamed of the wetness that streaked her cheeks. She had cried too much in her life, and tears never saved anyone. As she ate, he cleaned the table, moved quietly about the small room, and finally sat down with his own piece of fruit. They ate together in silence, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel like waiting for punishment. It felt safe, but safety was more dangerous than any whip. Safety made the heart weak. Safety made the mind dream. She swallowed hard and told herself she would not fall into that trap. Humans were cruel. Kindness was a mask. Sooner or later, it would be ripped away and the monster beneath would show itself. She braced herself for that moment, even as her hands shook with the sweetness of the fruit still on her tongue. The sound of metal on wood startled her, and she spun around, heart racing. He was holding the key, the same one he had used on her wrist cuffs before. Her body froze. Every muscle braced for the trick she had been expecting all along. He stepped closer, not rushing, not threatening, and crouched beside her. For a moment she thought he would lock her again, but instead he slipped the key into the collar at her neck. With a small click, the iron loosened and fell heavy into his hand. Her hands flew to her throat, rubbing the raw skin, feeling the strange lightness of air where iron had pressed for so long. She staggered back, clutching herself, her breath sharp and panicked. No one had ever taken a collar off her without replacing it with something worse. Her eyes darted to his face, searching for cruelty, for mockery, for the punchline of this game. But his expression was unreadable, calm in a way that frightened her even more than anger could. He carried the collar to the table and set it down, almost carelessly, as if it meant nothing. To her it had meant everything. It had been her identity, her cage, her sentence. Without it, she felt naked, exposed, unanchored in a world she no longer understood. She wanted to scream at him, demand to know why he was doing this, but her voice locked in her throat like it had for years. When he turned away to busy himself with something else, she stared at the door. It was there, right in front of her. She could run. No chains held her now, no collar weighed her down, but her legs didn't move. Fear anchored her more than iron ever had. What if she ran and was caught? What if she was dragged back to the market? What if he had only freed her to see if she was foolish enough to believe it? Her chest heaved as she battled herself. Every part of her screamed that freedom was a lie, that safety was a trick, that no one bought a slave for $10 without cruel purpose. Yet there he was, pouring water into a cup, as if she was invisible, as if he didn't expect her to bow or serve or beg. She took a small step back, her bare feet creaking against the wood. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes catching hers. For a heartbeat, she thought he would order her back, but instead, he said nothing. His gaze was steady, not commanding, not cruel, and then he returned to what he was doing. That silence was worse than chains. It left her suspended in uncertainty, unable to tell if she was truly free or still bound in ways she couldn't see. Her hands trembled as she touched her throat again, feeling the bruises the iron had left behind. They hurt, but the hurt was hers alone now. She swallowed, her throat dry, and realized she didn't know what she feared more, the life she had escaped, or the strange man who refused to treat her like a slave. She sank slowly to the floor, pulling her knees tight to her chest, and stared at the collar lying abandoned on the table. It should have been a victory, a moment of joy. Instead, it felt like a storm gathering over her, silent and heavy, waiting to break. She slipped out when the sun was low, the shadows long and golden. The door had been left unbarred, the path clear. Her bare feet carried her fast across the dirt, heart thundering with each step. Freedom tasted sharp, almost bitter, as though her body didn't believe it. She didn't look back. She told herself she would never look back. But freedom wasn't empty fields and open skies. It was alleys with hungry eyes, strangers who saw her torn dress and bruised skin and recognized what she was. A pair of thugs blocked her path, their grins wide, their hands reaching. "Run away," one said, his voice slick with hunger. "Worth a price at the block." She stumbled back, her breath breaking into gasps, her hands curled into fists, useless against the bulk of them. They laughed at her fear, stepping closer. For a moment she thought of screaming, but she knew how that always ended, with fists, with pain, with silence forced back into her throat. Then a shadow fell across them. He stood there, the man who had bought her for $10, calm and still. His eyes locked onto the thugs, and something in his stance shifted like steel hidden beneath plain clothes. The laughter died. The taller thug spat on the ground, trying to look brave. "She's a stray, doesn't belong to you." His reply was steady, without anger. "She belongs to no one." The words struck her like fire. "Belongs to no one." She had never heard them said about her. Before she could process them, the fight began. His movements were quick, sharp, like a storm breaking without warning. He dodged a strike, countered with a fist that sent one thug sprawling. The other rushed him, but a kick drove the man back into the dirt. Dust rose, shouts echoed, and within moments the two lay groaning on the ground, clutching their wounds. She stood frozen, chest heaving, unable to believe what she saw. No one had ever fought for her. No one had risked anything for her. Slaves were property. Property wasn't worth bruises or blood. Yet here he was, fists bloodied, eyes steady, standing between her and danger. He turned to her, breathing hard but not victorious. He didn't smile or demand thanks. He simply held out his hand. Her body locked, torn between terror and something deeper she couldn't name. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached forward and touched his palm. His grip was firm but gentle, pulling her back onto steady feet. The thugs fled into the shadows, their curses trailing behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by her uneven breaths. She stared at him, eyes wide, words trapped inside her. She wanted to ask why, wanted to demand what he expected in return, but no voice came. As they walked back together, she felt the shift inside her. Fear still lived in her chest, but alongside it was something new. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was the beginning of a question, a dangerous, trembling question. What if he truly meant it when he said she belonged to no one? She touched the fabric with hesitant fingers, the dress soft against her skin in a way she had never known. It wasn't fine silk or royal cloth, just a simple human dress, plain and clean. To her, it felt like a treasure. She stared at it for a long time before daring to slip it over her shoulders. The fabric whispered as it fell into place, and for the first time she looked into a cracked mirror and didn't see a slave. She saw someone else, someone she barely recognized. He didn't watch her with hungry eyes when she stepped out wearing it. He only nodded once, as though it was normal, as though she was meant to wear something of her own. The simplicity of his reaction made her chest twist. In the market, every glance had been cruel, mocking, or full of lust. His was neither. It was steady, quiet, and strangely safe. He set food on the table and motioned for her to sit across from him. She obeyed slowly, sitting stiff, her hands on her lap. He didn't rush her, didn't bark orders, didn't push. When she finally picked up a piece of food, he smiled, not wide, not mocking, just a small, calm curve of the lips. The warmth in it made her heart race worse than fear ever had. Later, he showed her how to hold a spoon, how to eat slowly instead of snatching food like an animal afraid of losing it. She hated herself for how clumsy she was, spilling drops, fumbling, hands shaking. Each mistake made her brace for a strike, but no strike came, only patience, only quiet correction. Each moment shattered another stone of the wall she had built around her heart. That night, after the meal, he showed her a book. She tilted her head, confused, as he opened it and ran a finger along the words. His voice was soft as he read aloud. The language was simple, the story even simpler, but it was a story meant to comfort, not to wound. She listened, her eyes wide, as if each word was a piece of magic. When he handed her the book, she held it as though it might break. She traced the letters with trembling fingers, feeling their strange power. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something, anything, but her tongue was heavy, her voice locked away by years of silence. Still, the thought rose inside her like a flame. Maybe he wasn't a master. Maybe he was something else entirely. But the shadows outside whispered a warning. Through the cracks in the wall, she caught sight of figures in the distance, watching the house. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, too far to confront, too close to ignore. Her chest tightened. She knew what they were. Scouts, slavers, hunters. Her people didn't forgive runaways. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the book still pressed to her chest. Safety had always been a lie. And if someone was watching, if they had seen her here, then sooner or later the past would come crashing through the door. She turned her head and looked at him sleeping on the floor again, peaceful and unknowing. Her hands gripped the blanket tightly. She had braced for pain all her life, but now she feared something worse. She feared losing this fragile, impossible thing he was giving her, a life she never thought she could have. The knock on the door came before dawn, sharp and heavy, echoing through the small house like thunder. She shot up from the bed, heart leaping into her throat. He was already awake, standing at the door before she could even breathe a warning. When he opened it, 3 men stood outside, their faces shadowed, their clothes marked with the insignia of traitors. "We heard you bought one," the tallest said, his smile sharp and cruel. "Cheap too. Hand her over. She belongs back on the block." Her body locked in fear. The words were chains, dragging her back into the dust of the marketplace, back into the laughter of the crowd. She gripped the blanket until her knuckles turned white. She braced herself to be shoved forward, traded again, broken again. That was the way it always ended. But his voice was steady. "She's not for sale." The men laughed. "Not for sale? She's property, human. You paid $10? You think that makes her yours? You think you can keep her?" He stepped forward, blocking the doorway with his body. "She's not property. Not mine. Not anyone's." The trader's laughter died into snarls. One moved his hand to the blade at his belt, but before steel could be drawn, the man who had bought her moved. The fight was swift, brutal, a blur of fists and wood and the crash of bodies against the wall. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trembling, watching as he stood against all 3. Blood slicked his lip, his knuckles split, but he didn't back down. Not once. When the traders finally fled, cursing into the night, silence filled the house again. He turned to her, breath heavy, blood on his cheek, and yet his eyes were calm. "You're free," he said, the words low but steady, as if spoken to the core of her soul. "Not theirs, not mine, free." Her knees gave out and she sank to the floor. Tears blurred her vision, hot and endless, and her body shook with a storm she couldn't hold back. For the first time in her life, she wasn't bracing for pain. She was breaking under the weight of something she had never known. Love without chains, protection without a price. He knelt beside her, not touching, not forcing, only waiting. Slowly trembling, she reached out and let her fingers curl around his hand. The warmth of his skin was steady, unshakable, like an anchor in the chaos. The collar that had once bound her still sat on the table, silent and useless. But in that moment she understood the truth. She had been sold for $10, less than the worth of spoiled fruit. But to him she was beyond value. And in his quiet defiance, in the blood he shed for her, she found something greater than survival. She found love where she had expected only pain.